My opponent has been in office for over 30 years. Over those 30 years, my opponent voted for an unjust war in Iraq.
He has weapons of mass destruction.
Deregulating Wall Street, school privatization, and building more prisons.
We need to put more cops on the beat, build more prisons, and support the crime bill.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jess Lenore. And that's Jamal Bowman, a progressive congressional candidate running in New York's 16th district, which is the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. The incumbent, the hawkish Eliot Engel, has held office for more than 3 decades, and his top donors include Wall Street and pro-Israel lobbyists. Bowman has rejected corporate PAC money and won the backing of progressive groups like Justice Democrats, who helped Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez unseat 10-term Congressman Joseph Crowley in 2018. But Bowman, a longtime educator and community organizer, faces a different challenge, a pandemic that has crippled traditional campaigning. Well, now joining us to discuss his congressional run is Jamaal Bowman, an educator and advocate for public schools for over 20 years. Most recently served as the principal for Cornerstone Academy for Social Action, or CASA, a public middle school he founded in 2009. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So New York's 16th district is the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. We're talking about mass graves. We're talking about hospitals that are just overflowing. Very, very hard hit. In your opinion, has Congress, specifically the democratically controlled House, done enough for this country, including your district?
There are progressives in Congress who have been pushing people's agenda and fighting for the working class and fighting for small businesses. Unfortunately, they're few and far between because the democratically controlled House, unfortunately, isn't being led right now by progressives. So they fought for a few things that were needed, but didn't go far enough. I mean, the first bailout package focused specifically on large corporations and the wealthy, and left small businesses and the working class to fend for themselves. In addition, there are still hospitals struggling to receive PPEs. There's still not enough masks. There's still not enough gloves. There's still not enough testing with efficient, quick results. There's still not enough testing sites. So a lot more needs to be done to put pressure on the White House to make sure that those who are most vulnerable in our district receive all of the care and all of the resources they need. And unfortunately, that's not happening right now.
So we know corporations have been bailed out to a tune of something which will amount to something like $6 trillion, and that number is growing. A lot of that has no strings attached, but as you said, the actual people have received very little except the $1,200 a month, $1,200 one-time stimulus payment.
One time.
And a lot of people haven't gotten that yet. So what does a progressive bailout look like? We know that, right now Congress and the Trump administration is implementing a shock doctrine. What would a progressive shock doctrine? Talk about what you would implement if you were in Congress right now.
Yeah, a progressive bailout includes a freeze on rent, a freeze on utilities, and a freeze on mortgages. It includes at least $2,000 per month, not a one-time payment of $1,200, and it includes efficient food production and distribution to those who are most vulnerable. And as opposed to allowing big corporations to use most of their money to buy back their own stocks, any corporation that's been behaving in that way, those corporations should be allowed to fail so that the people can have the resources they need to not just to sustain the pandemic, but to build the infrastructure that we need going forward to make sure working class people and the care economy overall is at the center of our political and economic systems.
So whether we're talking about the bailout or this upcoming election on June 23rd, I believe it was delayed because of the pandemic, we're really seeing a fight between within the Democratic Party, between the corporate wing and the progressive wing. You're taking on a candidate that has the backing of Wall Street, the Israel lobby. You have the backing of progressive groups. I know you've won just in the last few days, you picked up more and more endorsements. You've sworn off big money donations, but that means that you're relying on working people for donations, people that are hit really hard. by this crisis. So what kind of challenges are you facing, and how are you working to overcome them?
I mean, I got to tell you, I've fallen in love with the people of this country throughout the campaign, but even more so during this pandemic. Regardless of how much people are struggling, they're still willing to support our campaign because they realize the stakes. They understand if we're able to beat someone like Eliot Engel, who's been in office for 31 years, who's taken more money from weapons manufacturers than 144 Republicans in the House, and continues to support the military-industrial complex, war, and Wall Street. They understand that if we're able to win this race, it transforms the psychology of our country. It gives faith and hope to people who have been mostly disenfranchised. So people have been continuously supporting us. At the end of the first quarter, our first quarter fundraising actually beat the previous 2 quarters, despite being in the middle of a pandemic, because people are willing to help, people are willing to support. I think the movement that Bernie Sanders has created across the country has really been helpful. I think many who support candidates like Elizabeth Warren are more likely to lean into a campaign like ours. So it's been a challenge, but I got to tell you, the people of this country want to see change, and they continue to support us no matter what.
So I wanted to ask you, for communities like the Bronx, which are in District 16, some of the most disinvested communities in the country. We're talking about urban communities that have been subjected to redlining and to high levels of air pollution, all types of other issues. How do you reach out to people that have given up on the political process and said, look, we've had politicians in here for decades that haven't done anything to help us? How do you get them engaged in this process?
Well, first of all, I am an example of them. I am them. I lived in the housing projects. I lived in public housing. I lived in rent-stabilized apartments. I was raised by a single mom along with my 3 sisters. I had family members who struggled with addiction in a variety of areas. So I'm serving or running to serve a community which I come from, that is similar to the community that I came from. In addition, I've served this community for the last 10 years as a middle school principal. So I know intimately the issues that our children and our families face on a day-to-day basis. So when we started canvassing in early June, we were knocking on the doors of those most marginalized by our system throughout American history, but particularly for the last 50 years. We were knocking on those doors consistently, aggressively, and more importantly, we were listening to the issues that matter most to them. So we were bringing them into the process from the very beginning. And now that we're doing most of it via Zoom call and phone banking, we're just adding second and third touches to people who we were already able to meet throughout the campaign. We were lucky to start our campaign with hundreds of volunteers, making thousands of calls, knocking on thousands of doors throughout the campaign. So, it's different now and it's more challenging because of, the distancing and social distancing, but we were building those relationships and making the connections from the very beginning.
And we know since AOC's, stunning defeat of Joseph Crowley, who's been called the Queen's, the Democratic boss from Queens, like he was a really big party leader. We know that, the centrist Democrats have learned those lessons, and they're trying to raise as much money and consolidate their power. How are you going to overcome that? Especially, and also I want to add, we've seen that sometimes crises can be a moderating influence on elections. People want to choose a safe bet. They might think, look, at least we know what we're getting with the incumbent. How do you overcome those challenges?
Well, the problem with the machine, whether in Queens or in the Bronx, is they haven't done a good enough job of building relationships with working class people. Unfortunately, many of them have been co-opted by corporate interests and the wealthy in this country, which is why getting big money out of politics and publicly financed elections is a huge issue, not just for our campaign, but for progressives across the country. But, you know, they have this myth and this shadow of having, you know, control and being entrenched in terms of elections and in terms of our political system. But they haven't done the work to build the relationships over time, which is why when we're speaking to working class people and connecting with them, they often say, you know, they never see Eliot Engel. He is not present. He is not engaged, other than like a field day or you know, a one-off event. You know, he's not around, you know, so he doesn't know the issues. He doesn't know the concerns. He doesn't have the relationships. And the machine overall doesn't have those relationships. And Eliot Engel has done a good job of serving maybe 7% of the district. But there's another 93% that wants to be heard and wants to be listened to and wants to be a part of this process. So we're fortunate enough to be connecting with that other 93%.
And finally, you're coming to this this race through the lens of an educator, and we know that you know, there's a technology gap, there's a resource gap, especially in places like the Bronx or in Baltimore, where I'm talking to you from. I'm just reading a tweet right now from the Baltimore Sun. A recent survey of Maryland superintendents showed that as many as 25% of students in some districts had not signed into the internet to do lessons or hadn't picked up packets of papers. What is needed now for public schools? Because we know that, you know, that achievement gap starts really young, you know, especially in where you have working families that are essential workers that are going out to the front lines. What does this country need to do now to make sure that young people have the resources they need to succeed despite this crisis?
We need a one-to-one student to technology ratio. So every student should have access to a laptop or an iPad. We need Wi-Fi as a public utility, free at the point of delivery, so students can access Wi-Fi and the internet. In terms of the one-to-one student to laptop or iPad ratio, that needs to be provided by our Department of Education, by our cities, by our states, and by our federal government. In addition to that, there are many families who aren't comfortable or don't want their children, you know, staring at a computer all day. So cities and states in the country should provide stipends for those families to buy the books and resources they need from Barnes and Nobles and places like that, so that their children can work with paper and pencil and books if they choose not to use the technology. But this is not a new issue. You know, what the coronavirus has revealed is the inequality that already existed within our nation. Right here in this one district, you know, we have a tale of two districts. You have incredible wealth and resources in one area and abject poverty in another. You have schools being funded 2-to-1 when you compare schools in the Bronx or Mount Vernon or Yonkers to schools in Bronxville and schools in Scarsdale, to name a few. So there was inequality already in the system. Our schools were already underfunded. Class sizes were already too high. And the last thing I want to say is, you know, education is where all of the other issues intersect. So if a child is dealing with food insecurity, housing insecurity, unsafe places to play, lack of clean water or clean air, or dilapidated public housing, that child is going to struggle in school, because that trauma that comes from those other social issues impacts a child's ability to learn and thrive academically. So education is where all of the major issues intersect, and Congress has to take responsibility and do more for those who are most vulnerable.
All right. Well, Jamal Bowman, it was a pleasure to talk to you, running in New York's 16th district, which votes on June 23rd, if I'm correct. And
yes, but there's going to be some early voting that happens prior to that. So stay tuned for those dates. And the 16th district, I just want to mention, includes the North Bronx and Lower Westchester County, which includes cities like Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle.
All right. Well, we will check in with you for your race and see how things are going. We'll follow up on developments. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.